Welcome back, everyone. This is part 2 of Lecture 16, and we were talking about the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement, and how it had its genesis or its beginning amongst the free black population in America, in both northern and southern cities. So Frederick Douglass is one of the leading figures of the abolitionist movement during the 19th century. He was someone that could speak authoritatively on the institution of slavery, as he had once been a slave himself. He was born a slave in Maryland in 1817. Over time, he taught himself how to read and write in secret, all the while developing a plan to find freedom for himself. In 1838, after several failed attempts, Douglass finally managed to escape permanently to Massachusetts, and from that point on he dedicated the remainder of his life to trying to free his brothers and sisters in bondage. He spent a couple of years lecturing in England, of all places. He was worried about getting recaptured and brought back to slavery, so he joined an anti-slavery speaking group in England and made some money on a speaking tour there. And everyone who heard him talk was just amazed at how persuasive his words were. His speaking abilities were just truly exemplary. He was a very good motivational speaker. And on his return to the United States in 1847, Douglass, with some of the proceeds of his speaking tour, finally purchased his freedom from his former owner, so he didn't have to worry about constantly being retaken back into bondage from that point forward. Then, putting his reading and writing skills to work, he founded an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star in Rochester, New York. He also achieved really international renown for his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, in which he painted a horrifying picture of bondage. Despite all the beatings, the disappointments, as he said in his story, he never lost hope. But he also talked about how terrible it was to be treated like an animal and not a thinking, feeling human being in this state. So his works will do a lot to galvanize and bring the issue of slavery to the attention of many northern whites during this period. In the case of David Walker, we have a free black here who was born in Wilmington, North Carolina. He was the son of a slave father, but a free mother. And in the United States during this period, the status of the child followed the status of the mother. So because his mother was a free black woman, he was a free black woman. But he saw slavery up close and personal. His father was a slave. Many of his family members were slaves as well. As he grew into a young man, he moved from North Carolina to Boston and joined the free black community there, opening up a used clothing store. Over time, he felt compelled to write about the outrages of slavery, and in 1829 penned his famous pamphlet, Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, which contributed to the growing tensions regarding slavery during this time period. The audience of David Walker's appeal, in this case, was not whites. Instead, he was addressing it to slaves. And you can see from these excerpts that I've given you from the pamphlet published in 1829, he's trying to light a fire under, he's trying to motivate many slaves to finally rise up in mass rebellion against their owners. And also asserting, that this was their country just as much as it was anyone else. America's more our country, he said, than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears. That he really wants to try and incite a mass slave rebellion. For these reasons, Southern whites wanted David Walker dead. A bounty was placed upon his head of $10,000. And what's interesting is that he died the following year in 1830. Some people have wondered whether or not he was killed, poisoned. We'll never know, but he died the following year after this pamphlet was published. Another major figure in the growing abolitionist movement was William Lloyd Garrison, and here's a case where appearances can be deceiving. If you take a look at Mr. Garrison here, he looks like, kind of a quiet, soft-spoken accountant, someone more interested in numbers than people, but that was certainly not the case. For William Lloyd Garrison, he grew up in an abolitionist family, so from the day he, could learn how to speak and read and write, his was an effort to end this inhuman institution in the United States. As a young man in the early 1830s, he is a newer generation of abolitionists who are calling for immediate emancipation. Many of his father's and mother's generation were saying we can phase it out gradually over time so that Southern slaveholders won't be so up in arms about it. Garrison, though, is saying no. It needs to end, and it needs to end yesterday. So his will be a much stronger voice coming out against the institution of slavery, demanding its immediate end. And he will write often about the subject in his own anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. Garrison was aware that he was very controversial, that people said that his language, his tone was kind of a little bit too harsh, but he didn't care. As he said, quote, "I'm aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity?" he said. "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single bit, and I will be heard." Garrison is just letting it fly at this point in time. He's calling Southern slaveholders rapists. He's talking about, the abuse of slaves. He's speaking in much, much bolder terms. And as a result, his American Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded in 1833, by 1840 it had more than 150,000 members in just its 7 years of existence. And the American Anti-Slavery Society will publish a number of pamphlets and really try to get the attention of many northern whites in the United States to build momentum for a legal end to this institution of slavery. What we're going to see is that slave rebellions will not happen very often during this time period, but when they do, in the case of the Nat Turner Rebellion in particular, they could be extremely deadly. The most famous of all slave rebellions was definitely Nat Turner's revolt. Turner was born in 1800 on a farm owned by Samuel Turner in Southampton County, Virginia. At a very early age, Turner learned how to read and was reading the Bible constantly. He was just an extremely bright child. By the way, we know all of this because after the rebellion, Nat Turner himself was interviewed by a local doctor, and he wrote down Nat Turner's own words. So we actually have a one-to-one interview with Nat Turner on his motivations for leading the revolt. Many people also believed, as he was growing into a young man, that he had special powers of prophecy. For instance, when he was about 3 or 4 years old, his mother overheard him playing with several other children, talking about an incident that had reportedly happened before he had even been born. And he was talking about this incident as if he had actually experienced it firsthand. Encouraged by his parents and grandparents that he was meant for some special purpose, Turner, as he grew up, engaged in various activities and projects on the plantation, like pottery making, paper making, fashioning gunpowder. And so it was a huge shock to him at the age of 12 when he was finally sent into the fields for the first time to become an agricultural hand. This was very traumatic for him, and again, in this case, we have the benefit of his own words. He said the following, quote, "I am a slave. It's not just a word anymore. I'm really a slave, a piece of property to be worked and ordered around like a mule." Turner continued along a very spiritual path, though, becoming a slave preacher. He was reportedly performing miracles of healing, and it really had sort of created a whole aura or persona around him. In 1825, Turner had a vision, a series of visions, spiritual visions that he believed were leading him along the path to incite a mass slave rebellion. He said the following, quote, "I saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and the sun was darkened, the thunder rolled in the heavens, and blood flowed in streams. And I heard a voice saying, 'Such is your luck, such as you are called to see, and let it come rough or smooth, you must surely bear it.'" Turner decided the day of judgment was close at hand and that God had chosen him to initiate a mass slave rebellion. In 1831, he did just that. As he began the uprising, his final words to the men that were joining him was the following, quote, "Remember, we do not go forth for the sake of blood and carnage, but it is necessary," he said, "that in the commencement of this revolution, all the whites we meet should die, until we have an army strong enough to carry out the war on a Christian basis." So this is how the rebellion began. It started at 2 a.m. at the home of Turner's master. They began chopping up the family with axes and hatchets. They didn't want to use guns because the sound of gunshot might alert local whites and reveal the plan. The rebels then moved on to other neighborhood families, killing one after the other, heading to the town of Jerusalem, Virginia, where there was a stash of weapons there. Ultimately, the alarm was raised in the local white community, and after a busy afternoon of shots being fired, Turner and several of his comrades disappeared into the woods and eluded recapture for several weeks. Ultimately, though, by November of 1831, Turner was discovered. By late October. Then he was executed November 11th, 1831. In the rebellion, about 60 whites were killed. As many as 200 slaves lost their lives. So clearly not all slaves were going to wait for something to happen. They were willing to take matters in their own hands, willing to shed blood to achieve their freedom. Another very dramatic way in which slaves sought their freedom was by running away. And here's where Harriet Tubman becomes a seminal figure, a key figure in the Underground Railroad, which of course I'm sure you've all heard about, but just to reiterate, it was not a literal railroad, okay? It was instead a network of safe houses amongst free black families, amongst white families in the northern territories that would pass off slaves in secret, runaway slaves in secret, to try and get them to their ultimate destination, which was not the northern states, because you could still be recaptured and brought back to the southern states to slavery, but their ultimate destination was actually Canada, in which slavery had been done away with. So Harriet Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland, an upper South state, and after her owner died in 1849, she escaped successfully to the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And over the next 10 years, she made a number of trips, perhaps as many as 19 trips back into slave-controlled territory to help out perhaps as many as 300 other enslaved persons to make their way to freedom. She bragged that she never lost a single passenger on her many trips, and she devised several brilliant techniques for helping her passengers make their way to freedom. She, for example, would encourage slaves to use their owner's horse and buggy for the first leg of the journey so that they could put as much distance between the plantation and the people who were looking for them to try and get as much distance away from there as possible. She would encourage runaway slaves to leave on a Saturday night, because the runaway slave notifications that were printed in newspapers would not be placed in newspapers until Monday morning. So that would give you the maximum amount of time before the notice would be raised and people would be looking for you. She would also encourage runaway slaves to turn and head south if they heard the bark of the slave dogs and they knew that the slave catchers were on their heels, because south was the direction that no one would expect them to be running in. They all expect runaway slaves to be running north. She also would carry a sedative to use on babies if they began to cry, while they were hiding out, and possibly reveal the location of slaves. She would make sure to kind of quiet the child that way. She also carried a gun with her, which she used to threaten certain fugitives if they became scared and decided to turn back. She would reportedly point the gun at them and tell them, quote, "You'll be free or die." So she was a tough lady, brilliant individual, and as word of her work spread, a bounty was placed on her head by Southern slaveholders to the tune of $40,000 reward for her dead or alive. Fortunately, she escaped the bounty hunters during this period, and during the Civil War actually served as a spy for the Union Army, listening in Confederate camps and passing along information to the Union Army. So, yeah, the Underground Railroad did not really cease until the Civil War, and resulted in the liberation of perhaps thousands of slaves over several decades worth of time.